October 12th, 1492. Christopher Columbus arrived in the Bahamas, forever altering global history. For centuries since then, this date has been remembered and celebrated. How wonderful for Europeans to have discovered so much unclaimed land. Today, we know there were somewhere between 75 and 112 million people here, but the lives of the living nations inhabiting this land were deemed irrelevant because they were so different from the lives of the people newly arriving. We talk often about the human rights violations, the genocidal policies, the gobsmacking, unbridled racism, the ongoing and even current injustices those people endured. Every year we use this holiday weekend to remind ourselves of the sinister history from which we have all benefited. Today, instead, I'm thinking more about what we lost, us, Americans. What would our culture be like if instead of conquering, enslaving, and defeating, Europeans partnered, learned, collaborated? What did we lose by killing the cultures, languages, and people who were here? Right here in New York City, the story is often told, sort of laughingly, that the Lenape sold Manhattan for a handful of beads. Like, we got one over on them. We know that the Lenape thought that they were entering a treaty, right? That the beads were just a gift from the newcomers to share this space. They had no sense at all of selling and owning land. That was not in their framework. The Dutch, though, understood selling and buying, and they had no intention of sharing. And once that trade was made, they were constantly frustrated by the Lenape's continued presence. Once you sell a house, you can't keep living in it. Right there, we lost an opportunity to learn this deep and ancient wisdom. No one owns the land. The land lives independently. We are in reciprocal relationship with the land. When new people arrive, we are in reciprocal relationship with them too, as partners on the land. For a church so deeply embedded in New York City real estate, I can't help but stare at all we lost by not learning the lesson the Lenape were offering with that bag of beads. The Lenape could teach us about partnership and the absurdity of ownership, and about being people rooted in place. In most indigenous languages, there are far more verbs than nouns. In English, about 70% of our words describe people, places, and things. Indigenous languages approach this naming differently. They separate that which is living from that which is inanimate. Robin Wall Kimmerer tells the story of trying to learn her language of origin, Potawatomi. She learns the nouns pretty easily, but she really can't understand the verbs. There are too many of them. They don't make any sense. So this is her story. She writes, I remember paging through the dictionary, trying to decipher the titles, but the spellings didn't always match, and there are too many variations on a single word, and I was feeling like this was just way too hard. The threads in my brain knotted, and the harder I tried, the tighter they became. Pages blurred and my eyes settled on a word, a verb, of course, to be a Saturday. Ugh. I threw down the book. Since when is Saturday a verb? Everyone knows it's a noun. I grabbed the dictionary and flipped more pages, and all kinds of things seemed to be verbs. To be a hill, to be red, to be a long sandy stretch of beach. And then my finger rested on Wikawagama, to be a bay. It's ridiculous, I ranted in my head. There's no reason to make this so complicated. It's no wonder no one speaks this. A cumbersome language, impossible to learn, and more than that, it's all wrong. A bay is most definitely a person, place, or thing. It's a noun, not a verb. I was ready to give up. And then I swear I heard the zap of synapses firing. An electric current sizzled down my arm, through my finger, and practically scorched the page where that one word lay. In that moment, I could smell the water of the bay, watching it rock against the shore and hear it sift onto the sand. A bay is a noun only if the water is dead. When bay is a noun, it is defined by humans, wrapped between its shores and contained by the word. But the verb, wikawagame, to be a bay, releases the water from bondage and lets it live. To be a bay holds the wonder that for this moment the living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores, conversing with cedar roots and a flock of baby mergansers, because it could do otherwise. Become a stream, or an ocean, or a waterfall. And there are verbs for that too. To be a hill, to be a sandy beach, to be a Saturday. All are possible verbs in a world where everything is alive. So the word to be in Potawatomi is Yahweh. Now, I don't know if there's a linguistic connection at all, but when Moses saw the burning bush and spoke with God who was telling him to free his people, Moses said, "Who should I say sent me?" And the response was, "I am who is. Yahweh, I am who is. I am." It is all being. The Potawatomi could teach us how to relate to all the world as a verb. I'm in New York. I set up a Zoom call, 10 o'clock. The person I'm meeting with isn't there. 10:01, I send a text reminder. 10:05, I've left the call because the other person is too late and I have things to do. I need to move on. We're gonna have to reschedule. I'm on Lake Traverse Reservation in South Dakota. I was told to bring my students in the afternoon. I don't know what that means, but it's about 1 o'clock. I've gotten my group of undergrads to a patch of grass near a stream we've been using as our only source of running water. My students lie on the grass for a bit and then realizing we don't know what will happen or when, they pull out a Frisbee to throw around. There are no cell phones in the 90s, but it wouldn't have mattered because even today there's no cell service on Lake Traverse. So we wait in the grass. I don't know for how long. Darlene comes and she brings her brother and her son. Her son joins the Frisbee game. Her brother sits on the grass. Darlene has a beach chair. She unfolds it and sits down. She starts to tell stories. She talks about the reservation and her history living there. She talks about hiding from people looking to take children to boarding schools, places from which children never really returned. She talks about poverty and alcohol and the struggle of living off this desolate land. A car pulls up, and another, then another. People, also members of the Lakota Nation, join us. They were also told to come in the afternoon. A woman starts walking toward us, and Darlene gets up and sits down next to me on the grass, now facing the chair she vacated. She explains to me that she is 63, but the woman coming is 71, so she gets the chair. And now she tells us stories. We all sit and listen. She speaks very slowly. No one interrupts. Someone named Toad says he's hungry. They agree. It's time for food. We travel a bit down the road to a building made of concrete blocks. We can smell dinner. We go inside where there are folding tables set up with aluminum pans filled with ground buffalo and fry bread. There are bleachers pulled from the walls where people are balancing paper plates, and we're invited to dig in. My colleague tells me that a basket was shown to him in case we have money. There's no charge for dinner, but if we can help, they'd appreciate it. There's already some cash in the basket, and I try to give generously. Jack, my colleague, points out while we're eating that whenever anyone wants to talk to us as a group, they approach him. Darlene tells us that's because he's the oldest in our circle. He adds that he's a man, and she says that's not relevant. Usually the women are in charge, so they'd assume that he would tell me what I need to know to lead the group, but as the oldest, he should always be the first to know. Once we've eaten and talked and even done some dancing, we see people are leaving. It's dark. It's time for us to go. Darlene tells us she'll see us tomorrow. I ask her when we should be ready for her. She tells me that when she arrives, we'll be ready. I spent 3 weeks without looking at a clock. The Lakota can teach us a new way of understanding time. The Trail of Tears started in 1838. The Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, and Choctaw nations were moved out of their homes, forced to walk 1,000 miles and relocated on less hospitable land in an attempted genocide. In 1847, the pain from that state-sponsored action was still fresh. They were living in trauma and an ongoing crisis of displacement and grief when they heard the story of the Irish. The British colonized Ireland and forced the Irish into brutal living and working conditions to pay rent to live on their land, the land that had been taken from them. Irish families were existing in windowless huts in holes they dug in bogs and in the sides of mountains. They worked for the British, sometimes growing grain that they were not then allowed to eat. Poor Irish subsisted on potatoes and bits of herring or bacon if they could find it. Living in such squalor meant living on the edge between life and death, maintaining a very careful balance. When a blight meant no more potatoes, thousands and ultimately 1 million people fell victim to starvation. More than 1/8 of the entire Irish population died. In a village in County Mayo on the west coast of Ireland, the people became desperate. They and their children worked all day for the British but had no food and no hope of finding food. One afternoon, the people in the village decided to walk the 20 miles to the nearest town where there were plenty of British and more than enough food. They walked along the cliffs and made their way to find people in their homes and in pubs having their supper. They asked for food but were denied. Over and over, the people turned them away. Still starving, they began the trek home. But on the way, every one of them died. The entire village succumbed to starvation and despair. Some may have been too weak to make their way back. Others may have jumped off the cliffs knowing death was all that was left anyway. Their village was left untouched, frozen in time for 150 years before anyone found it and started telling their story. When the Choctaw heard the story of the Irish in 1847, they were moved. They knew what it felt like to be part of a systemic effort to erase you and your people. 2 Irish people, part of the 1 million who fled Ireland, found their way to Oklahoma to tell the story and to ask for help. It is hard to imagine a people less able to offer assistance. And yet, they did everything they could. They took up a collection. They sold what they had. They dove into their own reserves and came up with $710, which is about $5,000 today. That money was used to purchase food that could travel, which was sent across the Atlantic and used to feed villagers on the west coast of Ireland. Now, I know this story very well because the man with whom I studied in Ireland was the one who learned of the fate of the village in County Mayo. He started something called the Great Famine March, retracing the steps from the village to the town where the people were rejected. He uses that march as a fundraiser to help people who are starving all over the world. About 10 years after he started it, a member of the Choctaw Nation, Gary Whitedeer, joined him. Actually, Gary had flown over to participate in the walk, and he and Don met and really hit it off. And together, they recovered this story of the gift from one nation to the other, from one desperate people to another. And I know this because I worked for Don and Gary briefly as they were forming this organization, using the story of generosity to inspire people globally to help those who are starving. The Choctaw could teach us a new way of understanding compassion and generosity.